Wild Horse Management Group spearheaded a rally in downtown Salt Lake City at the BLM headquarters to raise our collective voices for the Onaqui herd in an attempt to stop the pending roundup that was scheduled to happen that summer. This year, because of COVID-19, we're unable to safely provide an event for all of us who care about this cherished herd. So here we are virtually, as a way for all of us to come together to hear more about these horses from experts, locals, and photographers, and to provide online actions for you to take. So we're gonna go ahead and jump right in. Some of you may be new here, and so we wanted to give you a quick overview of the situation. So please enjoy this quick video.
Have you ever seen a Mustang up close? In Utah, the Onaqui wild horses roam free through the Great Salt Lake Desert. Peaceful and beloved by horse enthusiasts who travel just beyond the ski hills and festivals to witness their majesty.
I'm Kimberly Curl. I'm a wild horse photographer, and we're out here on the Onaqui Range in Utah. The Onaqui is a unique place in the sense that the herd has a real interesting way of moving with the landscape. They move in larger bands, and the larger bands move in a giant herd. You don't get to see that in any other area. It's a really unique, tightly knit society of horses, and their community means everything to them. Year after year, because I've been coming here so often now, I've gotten to see foals grow up and move on to other herds, have their own babies. Been able to watch stallions that were once the king of the range, now living a life as a bachelor with a buddy on the outskirts, still within the community, still very much part of the herd dynamics of this area, but living the life that an older horse does, and why should that be taken away from him?
Tragically, the government agency that controls the open range, the Bureau of Land Management, is planning a roundup that will destroy the wild horse families that people all over the world have come to know and love. These roundups expose senior horses and newborn foals to dramatic helicopter stampedes, which often cause death by exhaustion or injury. There is a misconception that wild horses have overrun other grazing animals on these lands. In fact, the BLM roundups can cost upwards of $500,000, while the cost of keeping the horses removed from the range in holding pens for life could exceed $10 million. All so that thousands of privately owned sheep and cattle can graze the public lands that just 500 Onaqui horses call home. A local organization is implementing a humane birth control darting program that will effectively manage the size of the herd over time, and at a fraction of the cost. Although the BLM is not giving the program time to work. Instead, another roundup is imminent. So, as Robert Hammer wrote in Salt Desert Mustangs, these imperiled symbols of our national heritage need all the teammates and fans they can get right now. These horses deserve to stay home with their families where they can be observed, documented, and cherished. Learn more about our tried and tested birth control methods now. And please, raise your voice to the BLM. Let's keep wild horses wild.
Okay, so now that you have a better understanding of what's at stake, I'd like to introduce you to our first guest, Kimberly Curl. Kimberly is a renowned wild horse photographer whose images can be seen displayed all across AWHC's website, in celebrity homes, and publications. She's been visiting the Onaqui herd since 2009 and is going to share with you a few stories of these horses to show you what will be lost if the BLM is allowed to proceed with its roundup and removal. So without further ado, Kimberly Curl.
Hi everyone, I'm Kimberly Curl. I'm a wild horse fine art photographer, and I'm really glad you're all here today in support of saving the Onaqui herd, a herd that we all love and cherish very, very much. I'm just going to share with you a couple images and a couple stories and experiences that I've had in the wild over the years. I've been visiting this herd since 2009, and I've seen some pretty remarkable things. So I just wanted to share a couple stories with you so that you can feel a little bit more intimate with these horses and some of their lives and what they've been through. So with that said, to explain this story, it was a really early morning, and the horses were in a completely different valley, and we were up above on a hill looking down on them. And it was so remarkable because this herd is so unique in how they stay together and form a large herd. So multiple bands form a very large herd on the Onaqui Range. And as someone who had researched wild horses quite a bit, I didn't expect to see so many horses in one area at one time. So my emotions were quite overwhelmed the entire time I was there. And this herd was in this valley and just peacefully grazing. And I slowly, all of a sudden, noticed one gray horse, which they're easy to spot out at a distance, had turned their nose a different direction, and almost in line with that horse, which was, I found out later, was a mare. The other horses had started to turn their noses into the same direction, and they were grazing, but they started to pick up their pace, and the grazing moved into a slow trot, which moved into a canter, which moved into a gallop, and they were running to water. Who I was with knew where that watering hole was, and so we were able to get into a vehicle, race over to the watering hole. We actually made it to the watering hole before the horses did, to set up cameras and watch these horses literally spill down a hill into this beautiful watering hole, all of them at once. I mean, it was a sight to see. It still is such a sight to see, and it never gets old for me. But what happened during this moment, that is a story I want to share with you, is up on the hill, towards the end of 200 and plus horses spewing down into the water, a mare was racing in circles and whinnying and screaming, and you could tell that she was very distressed. And I had binoculars, so looking up at the hill, I could see that a young horse was struggling, and I couldn't figure out what it was struggling on, which we ended up figuring out it was barbed wire. And the foal had gotten caught into a fence that probably shouldn't have been there. And I next saw the stallion was already halfway down the hill, and the stallion turned on his haunches, went back up to that hill, and what I thought was at first was going to harm the foal, because he positioned himself with his back legs towards the foal, which what it looked like, and started thrashing with his back legs. What he was doing was kicking the fence down. He literally kicked that fence apart until that foal broke free, and I was able to watch the mare, the foal, and the stallion all come down into the watering hole, be able to see the foal through long lenses, and he was okay, and the family joined the rest of the herd. And that, to me, being one of my first trips, was absolutely remarkable, a remarkable thing to see and to still remember and share with everybody, that stallion made that choice to go up and save his foal, protect his foal in any way, shape, or form that he could, and he did. These horses, their lives are everything to them. So that was, for one of my first experiences, something I'm never, ever going to forget. This is another stallion out on the Onaqui Range that I call Don Juan. He's one of my favorites to this day, and he's still living free. And I have watched this stallion, again, be a very grand stallion who has a remarkable number of mares, but stays a little bit away from the fray to keep them safe. If he has to fight, he does, and he will. And a couple of years ago, he endured a terrible injury to his back hock. Quite frankly, I think it might have been broke. I have some images of what looks like bone fragments sticking out of his hock. He has since healed, and he has actually regained some of his original mares back, which tells you he sought out to get the original mares from his original band. Not just any mare. He's acquired a couple others, but he's also acquired some of his original mares. So his original family is back with him after a good year and a half of being injured and solo on his own, healing out in the wild. I mean, watching him be off in the distance by himself, limping, hanging out with another bachelor stallion, old man, which many of us know, and I'm sure will be talked about during this rally, it was remarkable. It was sad. It was heartbreaking to see him so injured. But it's also been remarkable now over this last year to see him get his mares back. He has a foal on the ground this year. And the idea of him, what happened to that other stallion happening to him, it breaks my heart, because I don't see that this would be a horse that would be adoptable. He's an older stallion. He's been on the range for a long time. He's set in his ways, as he should be, and he deserves to live wild and free. So that's what we're all here for today. This is an image of him at a watering hole, and his family is there in the distance. They had all run off. They'd all been done drinking. And I thought, why is he still standing there? It was unclear to me why he wasn't running off with the family. And I turned around, I could hear something behind me, and about a yearling, maybe a long yearling, a year and a half old foal of his was still drinking. And so he waited there until that foal was done. And when the foal came out of the water, it was a little injured. I shouldn't say foal, it was a year and a half old. And because the mayor wouldn't leave a foal behind, but it was about a year and a half old offspring of his who was injured. The yearling was fine, just injured, moving slow. And he stood there on that bank and waited until that offspring of his was done drinking. And then they walked out to the rest of his band together to resume their day on the range. I don't see why that should be taken away from them. This is why they do what they do. These stallions, this is what they do. This is what they are. They're everything. Family is everything to them, and it matters to them. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support of American Wild Horse Campaign, and especially this herd that means so very much to me and so many other people. Their lives matter. Wildness matters, and without it, we're lost. So in the spirit of Earth Day and this rally, I will be offering 20% off on my conservation prints link, and 20% will also go to the American Wild Horse Campaign. So if you want to give in that way and have one of these beautiful images of the Onaqui herd in your home, please feel free to do so. And thank you all for being here. Stay safe out there, stay wild, and let's make sure these horses, let's make sure they matter.
Thanks, Kimberly. All right, so here's your first call to action. In just a moment, you're going to see a pop-up on your screen. If you have Twitter, you can just click the button to send an automated tweet to the BLM and the Interior Department, urging them to stop the roundup and removal of the Onaqui wild horses. We're going to give you a few moments to complete this, and here's some music to enjoy while you act.
I'm the kind of girl that needs the wind, riding with the fire in my eyes, flying straight through the open wide. 'Cause baby, I'm a wild horse. Don't try to tame me, baby. I'm a wild horse. Ain't gonna break me.
Thanks so much for taking action. You all are the best. Next up is Rob Hammer, a Utah native, wild horse photographer, and author of the book Salt Desert Mustangs. Rob also runs a website called Wild Horse Tourist, and if you haven't already visited it, I would highly recommend it. He provides GPS coordinates to find horses and burros in the entire state of Utah and provides a ton of other great information. Rob is going to briefly chat with you all about what these horses mean to him and why we must stop this roundup. So take it away, Rob.
Hi folks, my name is Rob and I'm a wild horse addict, advocate. Actually, wild horse viewing can be very addictive, and I'm convinced that Onaqui is a gateway herd. One of the most telling facts I can share with you from my own experience is that most of the visitors to the Wild Horse Tourist website don't enter through the home page. Instead, they come directly to the Onaqui Mountains page. This website currently offers over 24 herd areas, yet 40% of all page views hit the Onaqui page. For contrast, the home page accounts for just over 10% of all traffic, and the second most popular herd area, Cedar Mountains, pulls in just under 7%. In fact, the Onaqui Mountains webpage regularly racks up more views than all other herd areas combined. And perhaps more tangibly, I have personally escorted folks from across the country, in fact, from as far away as Germany, out into the desert for the sole purpose of viewing these horses. And I hear from people all the time looking for additional information as they plan trips from out of state to come here and see the famous Onaqui horses for themselves. Thinking back on my own introduction to wild horses, my understanding progressed rather quickly from the initial excitement of learning that, yeah, there really are wild horses right out there in the West Desert, to the horror of realizing that their continued existence is under constant threat. And most often, that threat comes through the very agency tasked with their protection. This recognition was one of the main reasons I started the Wild Horse Tourist website. Of course, I had already become familiar with organizations like the American Wild Horse Campaign and the Cloud Foundation, so I knew factual resources and structured activism were already available. And I certainly didn't feel that I could add anything of real value to what these professionals had already been doing for years. But what I might be able to do is help popularize wild horse viewing as a unique recreational opportunity. So toward that goal, I tried to design this website in a manner that would exclude overt politics and legal arguments, and I would just leave those matters to the experts. And instead, I would set out to provide an inviting introduction to wild horse viewing, hoping to convince folks that this is something that they can and really should do for themselves, and giving them all of the information they need to be successful. I figured if people would just get out there and see the horses for themselves, how could they help but fall in love? And based on my own experience, once they're hopelessly smitten, it's probably a short span of time before they visit one of the advocacy websites where they'll learn more about the politics and the legal issues. The point is that by then they've already fallen in love, so perhaps they'll be more likely to dive in headfirst and support the cause in a meaningful way. I have no way of knowing how effective this is, but if I have a hidden agenda, that's it. So yes, without question, Onaqui is Utah's premier gateway herd. And why not? It's the easiest herd to access from the state's most populous metropolitan areas. It straddles the famous Pony Express Trail, with the Simpson Springs way station providing the perfect focal point, complete with restrooms, improved camping, picnic tables, and a popular herd watering hole just a few hundred yards away. And the Pony Express is only a small part of the fascinating history of this area. But most importantly, the Onaqui horses are generally very easy to find and ridiculously accommodating to bipedal gawkers and photographers. And these horses are as gorgeous as the landscape that surrounds them. In fact, if you were to try to design the perfect gateway herd, you'd be hard-pressed to do better than Onaqui. But I want to focus specifically on the fact that the Onaqui horses are so easy to find. This is absolutely crucial. Reducing the herd size by nearly 80% will undoubtedly turn this present fact into just another historical tale. And we cannot let that happen. Now, right now, with the political landscape shifting in a direction that seems more favorable to our cause, right now is the time to double down on our commitment to these animals. All of them, from the gateway herds to the most remote and reclusive hardcore fixes. We need to make certain that everyone currently ascending to a seat of power with any influence over herd management policy hears our voices and commits to acting on the sensible, science-based, proven solutions championed by AWHC and the broader coalition of wild equid advocates. Very often, and especially this time of year with the summer roundups looming, I receive emails from folks from across the country and occasionally from around the world, asking what they might do to help protect wild horses from the BLM's callous and destructive approach to population management. My response is always the same. Take a little time to research the advocacy organizations like AWHC, the Cloud Foundation, or if Onaqui is your specific concern, Wild Horses of America is another great option. Get on their mailing lists, participate in their calls to action, And by all means, contribute financially if you can. Help these experts do what they do best, organizing our community, lobbying congressional and executive leaders, championing science-based herd and range management philosophies, and, when necessary, bringing effective legal action to stop the BLM's too often illogical and cruel activities. This is where we find hope. Finally, let me state my personal position on the BLM's plans for Onaqui and, in fact, their approach to herd management in general. I'll keep it simple. This area was established nearly 50 years ago as a protected habitat for these horses. I know subsequent legislation mandates multiple use, but that multiplicity has skewed way too far in favor of the range ranchers. It's as if the available forage and water were a pizza, and 50 years ago they said, let's reserve this pizza for the wild horses, only to come back a few years later to take 4 slices and auction them off to the ranchers. And then they come back and say, you know what? The ranchers liked getting those slices at below market prices so much, we're going to give them 3 more. Oh, and that 1 slice you have left, we'll be back to pick away at the toppings. Oh, and by the way, there's not enough pizza here for all of you, so most of you will have to go. Look, people travel to this state from across the country, and again, even from around the world, with a goal of seeing these horses in their wild habitat. They don't want to spend all that money and come all this way, only to find that a herd or flock of domestic grazers has crowded out the horses. For that matter, they don't need to see a single cow or sheep anywhere within the boundaries of the Onaqui HMA. And neither do I. With that, I do want to thank Grace, Suzanne, and everyone at AWHC for inviting me to participate today. I am constantly impressed and amazed by the things you and your incredibly smart and capable team do every day to protect our wild horses and burros. You are my heroes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob, for your kind words and all that you do for wild horses in Utah. Thanks so much, Rob, for your kind words and all that you do for wild horses in Utah. Okay, so it's time for our next call to action, and this one's in 2 parts. First, in the top right corner of your screen, you'll see a tab that's marked Handouts. Take a moment to open that tab.
2, 3, 4. Somebody left the gate open. You know we got lost on the way. Come save us, some runaway train gone insane. How do we not fade? How do we not fade away? How do we not into the world?
Okay, so the next step is to take that graphic and blast it to the Interior Department's Facebook page. In just a second, you're going to get another pop-up. Just click that button to be brought to the page and post it as you normally would.
Summer hills keep on rolling, helicopters, they patrolling. I read the news I got the blues. They say all the wild horses are going away. Let them be. Why can't you see? All the good things are wild and free. I heard them say they're going away. It's in our hand to protect their land. Don't let them go away. Leave them here to stay. Times are changing, people are changing. This is how we deal with things today. Our native friends help us build these lands. Can't just let them go away. Let them be. Why can't you see? All the good things are wild and free. I heard them say.
Okay, so before we move forward, I want to relay that if you've had any difficulties taking these online actions during the event, that we're going to be emailing you the full list of actions that you'll be taking today. So not to worry, they don't have to be done right now, though we would of course love all of the public pressure. So our next speaker is Eric Mulbar, who is Executive Director of Western Watersheds Project, an environmental watchdog organization that works to protect and restore Western watersheds and wildlife. We've teamed up with the organization on an action which you'll hear more about in just a little bit in an attempt to stop the Onaqui Roundup from proceeding. Eric is now going to give you an overview of the scapegoating that's currently happening within the Onaqui herd management area. So take it away, Eric.
My name is Eric Mulbar, and I'm the Executive Director of Western Watersheds Project. And I'm also a wildlife biologist. My scientific research has been published in peer-reviewed journals on moose behavioral ecology and the impacts of moose herbivory on plants and on ecosystem dynamics. And I'm going to see if I can share my screen here for this little bit. And first of all, I'd like to point out that Western Watersheds Project is not a wild horse advocacy group. In fact, we would consider ourselves more or less neutral on the issue. And we've come up with some thinking on wild horses that's been kind of officially pondered and adopted. And our thinking goes like this. The species Equus caballus originally evolved in North America, but went extinct on this continent over 7,000 years ago. Most paleontologists believe that today's wild horses date from escapees from the Spanish colonies in the 1500s, augmented over time by more recent escapees. On the other hand, an ethnographic study of indigenous oral history supports the concept that horses were already present in North America prior to the arrival of European immigrants. Like cattle, elk, and any other herbivore, wild horses can damage the range in cases where they become overpopulated. WWP supports the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, which directs federal agencies to maintain wild horses within a thriving natural ecological balance, a standard that ought to be applied to domestic livestock as well, but is not. In terms of overall numbers, there are an estimated 22,000 to 78,000 wild horses on Western public lands, compared to 2 to 3 million cattle. The livestock industry and some federal agencies disseminate misinformation about wild horses in an effort to distract the public and media attention away from much more serious and widespread environmental problems caused by domestic cattle and sheep on Western public lands. And WWP endeavors to correct the record based on the best available science. Now, the horses on Onaqui, I was out there last week, are in relatively good shape. These are fat little ponies. They're not starving. They're not in bad shape. They're not having a hard time finding enough forage. Most of them are in very fine fettle indeed. If you look hard enough, you can find a few that look like they're in rough shape. I'm told that this horse is called Old Man and is more than 30 years old and doesn't have any front teeth left. That's why he looks so thin and scrawny. That's not typical of the Onaqui herd. When I was out there, we looked at a herd that combined total of probably 150 adults as we were watching. And there were some offspring. There were probably 8 offspring for those 150 adults. So it seems like the PZP campaign is working for that particular herd. Now, the cattle tend to concentrate their activities in the lowlands, and they graze the living snot out of it. They really hammer it. This is a picture I took back in February when I was out in Onaqui, and in the background, those little black dots are cows. And in the foreground, that's the vegetation that's left after the cows have grazed on through. Now the cattle are down in these lowlands because that's where the water troughs are, and the cattle don't tend to forage very far from the water troughs. The wild horses were up in the uplands, pretty far away from the water troughs. And as you can see, the grass in these upland areas is in pretty decent shape. Wild horses rarely get into the sagebrush areas in the Onaqui area. This day, last week when we were up there were some up in the sagebrush. In fact, a sage grouse was flushed while we were out amongst these wild horses. It wasn't flushed by the wild horses. It was flushed because one of us photographers just about stepped on it, and that's why it flushed. But these wild horses have been blamed by the BLM for the demise and decline of the sheeprock's sage grouse population. I've been asking the BLM to produce their causal factor analysis showing the basis for that. And I was told that they hadn't finished it yet. And that's called prejudging the outcome, when you make reach a conclusion before you've even looked into what the factors are that are causing the sage grouse decline. And that has the same root as prejudice and prejudicial, and is certainly bad policy by a government agency to jump to a conclusion like that without any evidence. Now, the sage grouse habitat in this area, this is where we were watching the horses, was meeting the criteria that sage grouse need for their habitat. And sage grouse need 7 inches of grass height in order to have enough cover to escape their visual predators. And as you can see here in this photo, there's more than 7 inches of grass height in this general area. So the sage grouse have their needs met. Also in the Onaqui area, there is an area that has been fenced off to protect the vegetation after a burn that happened 3 or 4 years ago and allow it to come back. This is a photo from back in February when I was out in Onaqui. It's not my photo. It's a photo from a very talented photographer that I was traveling with. And as you can see, back in February, there was a pretty fair amount of grass in this area as a result of it being fenced off. However, the BLM has seen fit to let cattle back in this area to graze it. They're not letting wild horses back in this area, in this herd, even though it's about 30,000 acres and it's part of a herd management area, but they're letting the cattle graze it. So obviously the vegetation was good enough for them to graze. This is when we came back to the same, more or less the same spot here in April, and this is what it looked like. The cattle had slicked off pretty much all the vegetation. And after the burn, the idea was to give the grasses a chance to recover. And this is what the recovered grasses look like in April. Not very good shape, heavily overgrazed. This is an area where the cattle are grazing and the horses are excluded by this 4-strand barbed wire fence. This is an area that goes from this point where I took this photograph all the way out to the base of those mountains in the distance. It's probably about 30,000 acres. It's part of the Onaqui herd management area. It used to be accessible to the Onaqui wild horse herd. Now it's been fenced off from the horses, but now the cattle are back in there, and you can see a few dotting this picture. And they're getting exclusive access to this part of the herd management area. So they've created it essentially as a cattle preserve. And it's not looking in any better shape than the area that never was protected from anybody. As you can see, the cattle have grazed this area down to bare dirt once again, even though it looked pretty good back in February before the cattle started getting on this area. So that's 30,000 acres that could be used by wild horses, but instead is being devoted solely to cattle. And not only being devoted solely to cattle, but being badly abused by overgrazing authorized by the Bureau of Land Management. These are your public lands. Now, a lot of people come out to Onaqui to look at the wild horses. And you'd think that these are public lands that ought to be managed in the public interest, and that the public interest in looking and seeing and viewing wild horses might factor into the BLM's priorities. However, it seems that the interests of the livestock industry take precedence here in Onaqui and throughout the West. So do you think that that the public wants to see views like this with wild horses or views like this with cattle? Do you think anybody's going to come out and want to look at a landscape that looks like this? Now here I'm cheating because this slide is taken in the Red Desert last week as well. And that's also public lands. It's also an area that has wild horses too. But I don't have any pictures, any good pictures of cattle close up in Onaqui because, like many Americans, I don't want to take pictures of cows. I don't even want to see cows. I don't want private cows on my public lands. It doesn't make any darn sense. You know, I mean, if the cattle can be there at sustainable levels and not graze it down to bare dirt as they've done here, then I can live with it. But all too often, the BLM authorizes levels of grazing that are completely unsustainable for the native plants, and that causes cheatgrass invasion and loss of forage and impacts all the other wild creatures that are out there. So in closing, I would like to say, I think that the BLM is badly mismanaging the Onaqui herd management area. From my opinion as a professional biologist and a professional conservationist, I think it's not the horses that need to be reduced in Onaqui, it's the cattle. We need to get the cattle out of there. The cattle are doing the damage. The wild horses are being able to find forage in areas that look pretty good. And so that's my perspective in terms of what ought to be done going forward. But what we're suffering through right now is a wild horse management plan that was formulated by William Perry Penley. And William Perry Penley's plan for wild horses was all about getting rid of the wild horses and jacking up the cattle numbers. And they called that the path forward. I don't think it's a path forward. I think it's a path to ecological destruction. And I think the BLM needs to stop. So that's pretty much all I have to say this evening. And I hope everyone has the best of luck in getting the attention of the public servants who are supposed to be managing this land for a thriving natural ecological balance, but are doing a mighty poor job of it. And hopefully under a new administration, they can do a much better job. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, so here's your next call to action. In just a moment, you're going to get a pop-up on your screen with an action to contact Congress. Just hit that button to access it. We'll give you a few moments to get this completed before we move on to our next and final speaker.
2, 3, 4. Somebody left the gate open. You know we got lost on the way. Come save us, some runaway train gone insane. How do we not fade? How do we not fade away? How do we not into the world? How we living into the
Okay, so our final speaker is Brianna Schwartz. Brianna is AWHC's Director of Policy and Litigation. She's going to be giving you an update on what we have been working on behind the scenes for the Onaqui herd, as well as give you a final call to action. And then I'll be back in just a few minutes to close this event out.
Thanks, Grace. Hey everyone, my name's Brianna and I'm AWHC's Director of Policy and Litigation. Thank you for joining us today to use your voice to speak up for the wild horses of the Onaqui HMA in Utah. You've already taken to tweeting and that really matters, so keep it up. There's going to be a few more actions for you to take, so keep up the energy and let's really make a difference for these horses. Specifically, I'm here to tell you about what's been going on our end, or behind the scenes, if you will. As an organization, we're taking an approach that works to demonstrate to the BLM how important this herd is and how crucial it is for the agency to reevaluate how they are managed for the future. AWHC partnered with Western Watersheds Project to submit a new proposal for the management of the Onaqui horses that would not only allow for the current population of horses to remain, but for those horses to be free from being chased by helicopters for the foreseeable future. As many of you know, at the end of 2018, the BLM released a plan for managing the herd that unsurprisingly focused on more roundups and removals. Unfortunately, that plan was finalized and BLM removed 241 horses in 2019. What can be especially frustrating about trying to convince the BLM to adopt a more humane approach to wild horse management is that helicopters are allowed under the Wild Horse Act. Thus, unfortunately, that leaves us advocates in the difficult position of convincing the government that it shouldn't do something it's technically allowed to do in the name of a more humane approach. But never fear, we're ready to continue the fight and take on the challenge. You may be aware that there's an active PZP fertility control program already underway in the HMA. So our proposal focused on the need to allow time, actually just 3 more years, for the application of PZP fertility control to stabilize the population growth over time in this herd. We also emphasize the need for BLM to give wild horses a fair share of their resource by decreasing the livestock grazing that happens in the habitat. In line with this, we also asked that the whole habitat be open to their use, as it's currently only completely available to livestock. Throughout this process, we also worked with a coalition of organizations and photographers active in wild horse and conservation issues in this HMA in order to show the BLM that our proposal has broad support. This broad support includes you. So we still have a petition that's out there for you to sign that will ask Deputy Director Culver to stop the roundup in the Onaqui. We can make a difference for these horses, so please don't give up.
Wild horses, wild horses, wild horses, run faster, run faster, run faster. Wild horses, run faster, run faster, run faster.
Thanks, Brianna. Okay, so that concludes our Save Onaqui event. Thank you for attending, for taking action, and for caring about the Onaqui wild horses. Our lawyers have sent over the letter and plan that Brianna mentioned to the BLM just yesterday, and we'll keep you posted on the outcome. In the meantime, be sure to stay up to date on our social media channels and by signing up for our email alerts, which you can find at our website, AmericanWildHorseCampaign.org. And like I mentioned earlier, we'll be following up this event with an email of the ways to take action that were discussed here today, just in case that you missed it. So thank you again for caring about the Onaqui wild horses, and stay wild.
2, 3, 4.